Good morning, everyone. We have the opportunity, the privilege to study Parshat Mishpatim uh, this week and to look through a different, it's obviously this moment is where the Torah diversifies its content. Until now, it's been very much the narrative, and now we get the law. And in general, it's an important, we sort of see a number of different features that get deployed in even just the presentation. Um, and when you think about the experience of receiving the Torah, you can at times just think about the sheer number of of mitzvot, of commandments, of laws, of details, and lose sight of the broad scheme and the broad picture of the relationship with the Almighty, the opportunity to, you know, uh, use these as ways of ennobling yourself and refining yourself. And the Torah is very deliberate in describing the experience of Har Sinai in ways that you don't get caught in all the details, sort of what we see this week. And even the choice, not to harp on Haftorah, which we've spent years looking at, but even the choice of the Haftorah, every time we read about Matan Torah, about receiving the Torah, is chosen in a way to highlight the narrative that is about the experience, about the creation of the relationship with the Almighty, and not the law, the basic details, and all the different points that needs to be brought into that. At the same time, those are essential as well. And Mishpatim brings that to bear, brings us that peace. And even the way Mishpatim begins, Ve'ela HaMishpatim, that very famously looked at Vav, um, connecting the experience, the pomp, the circumstance, the incredibly moving, magnificent magic of Matan Torah is supplemented and rendered essentially connected with the details, right? That it's all one connectedness, and that I think is a really important piece that Mishpatim brings to bear. On the one hand, of course, we don't want to get lost in the details and lose the forest for the trees, and recognize that part of a religious outlook is the refined personality and the elevated spiritual status and the seeking of holiness and the relationship with the Almighty. But at the same time, that's done through the enactment of the commandments, through the details and at times the minutia of the way that we engage. And that's exactly this vav, connecting, the realms of the spiritual and the everyday civil law, social law, societal engagements with the ritual, cultic, personal engagements. It's the headlines and the fine print, all in one. All connected, that they are all essential components of what is the life of the Jew. And that is never to be underestimated. And it's really a work of literary beauty to sort of bring that and tie that together. Yeah, Chuck.
I just want to point out I normally follow along using Svaria, and under Mishpatim right now, the translation begins, "These are the rules," as opposed to "and these are the rules." There's absolutely nothing in there aside from the Vav in the Ve'ela, Ve'ela Mishpatim, that indicates that it's connected to what we had before in the translation. I was a bit surprised.
Well, maybe two things. One is I'm surprised they don't have and. I don't know why that is. Which commentary is that? I mean, they have different translations.
The Contemporary Torah JPS 2006.
Let's
That's
see. So the Mitsuda of 2009 says and these. Um, the JPS 1985 also doesn't have that. Rashi one has that. Onkelos has and. All the ones that seem to be connected to some sort of commentary definitely pick that up. But you're right. Meaning, one of the things that we can that in general a commentator, excuse me, a translator has to ask themselves is when to include the vav and when is the vav part of the narrative arc. Vayetze Yaakov, Yaakov went out. Does that mean and Yaakov went out? I mean, technically it does. technically it means and he went out, but not really. Vayetze is the structural form of the verb when you're telling the narrative arc. Yeah, and Jacob went out. Um, Here it's not a verb. So ve'ela, and that's why that's why our rabbis are very attuned to that. If this was just vayetze or vayidaber, then like one could say that vav isn't really significant. But ve'ela is not a it's not Ela is not is not a verb, right? It's not the verbal form, and therefore it really does say, and these are, so I would say, as opposed to how does the book of Shemot begin? Also, Ve'ela Shemot, right? And it's not and these are the names. So maybe, it could be either way. One would have to sort of look at the storyline here to see which which brings what. But in general, when you have the vav consecutive at the beginning of a section, um, where there's a verb, so it doesn't necessarily need to be rendered as and. If you give me a second, I can look at what Robert Alter says. He's an expert translator as well. I just have to pull his book off the shelf.
Just as an aside to everybody, when I was doing a postdoc in Berkeley, 1978 through 1980, Robert Alter's ex-wife, Judy Alter, used to teach Israeli folk dancing in Berkeley.
That's good to know. I don't think that's in the introduction here. Let's see. What do they say?
I'm sure it
This
isn't.
is 21. X is 21. And these are the laws that you shall set before them, says Robert Alter. As opposed to, let's see what he says at the beginning of Shemot. He also has, and these are. Let's just see one more thing. So he, in general, translates these all the ands as ends, meaning Vayetze Yaakov and Yaakov went out, not just Jacob left. So it's potentially a question about how to use the above consecutive or how to translate that. But clearly, our rabbis pick up on that in this context, and make the point that you should connect the two. Um, and Rashi makes the point exactly like that. And it's even more. For example, Rashi says at the beginning of this week's Parsha, Ve'ela hamishpatim, kol makom shnemar ela, any time that it says ela, pasel et harishonim. Pasal et harishonim. It invalidates what was said before, right? It's this as opposed to that. Ve'ela, and when it says and these, mosif al rishonim, adds to what was said. Ma rishonim misinai af elu misinai. Just like these were from Sinai, this also is from Sinai. The Lama Nismacha Parshat Dinim, the Parshat Mizbeach, that gets already filled into a different topic. And by the way, that might be true also at the beginning of Shemot as well, meaning the whole point of Eila Shemot is to tie back the story from Bereshit into the story of Shemot, the transition from the Jewish family to a narrative now about the Jewish nation, which happens at the beginning of Shemot. All right, we're introduced in that context, the beginning of the Parsha, which is begins with the laws of Eved Ivri, the Jewish Hebrew slave, which is a conversation, a very, obviously something that's not meet our current sensibilities. And really, as you delve deeper into it, it is something that really speaks to many of the values that we carry today for the reasons why we don't have them. But I want to just focus on that detail part. And this is an important piece as we read the rest of the Torah, as we're engaged with not just the narrative, but the laws and what is presented, the mitzvot. often we're confronted sometimes with a gap between what is the pshat, what is the simple explanation, and what is the halacha, what's the practice, right? And that comes up in some dramatic places, and that comes up in some places that are not as dramatic, right? Later on, we'll see it says if you hit someone or you damage someone, ayin ba'ayin, ayin tachat ayin, you should lose an eye for an eye, a foot for a foot, a leg for a leg, all those different things. And we know that right away the rabbis tell us that that's not really what it means, right? It means you pay for it, right? You pay in money. That's one type of situation. There are other times where we'll be presented certain halachic, certain things that seem to mean one thing, but perhaps the rabbis take it to mean something else, right? Lo tivashel gedi b'chalev imo. Don't cook a lad in its mother's milk, right? Teaches us that you can't cook, you can't eat, you can't enjoy any sort of milk and meat together, right? Right? It's not exactly what the simple explanation means, but the rabbis sort of teach us from that. And there are different examples of that. So I want to give one example that is to sort of approach it methodologically to sort of understand a little bit how that works, what that means, right? So let's see what happens. Someone becomes a slave for 7 years, right? I'm sorry, for 6 years, up for 6 years. After 6 years, what happens? What happens?
He goes free.
They're freed.
He goes free, right? He can go free. Excuse me, he can go free. What happens if he doesn't want to go free? Let's say he says, I love the security. I love whatever I see Cindy pointing to her ear. What happens? Verse number 6 over here. V'higisho Adonav el halokim, v'higisho el adelet olam mezuzah, v'ratza Adonav et arzno b'martzea v'avado leolam. That you bring him to his masters take him before the judges, and they put him by the door or by the lintel, by the doorpost. And they pierce his ear with a dowel or some sort of piercing tool. They pierce his ear with a piercer. And he is a servant forever. So this is a perplexing verse and a literarily very interesting verse to begin with. I just want to highlight one fascinating thing. Both Adonai and Elohim in this verse are not really referring to God, right? That's clear. They're not that. But it's so resonant of this idea of the challenge before God, by the way this is presented, that the judges are called Elohim, excuse me, and the master is called Adonai, is sort of invoking a notion of sort of God being in this equation, but not. And it's so easily done by using the language that it's used. Right, so let's just say out what we typically know about this. So what happens? Someone says, "I want to stay." We pierce their ear. Why do we pierce their ear?
Like the proverbial mark that everybody will always see that you've made this decision.
Right, but why?
I always got the impression that Hashem is not really in favor of this sort of decision, that if he's
All
going
right.
to do this,
How'd you get that impression?
because of this as a penalty as opposed to going free.
What makes you think this is a penalty? This is sort of maybe this is just the rite of passage. You want to stay? You can.
Modern day sensibility.
I don't know if it's modern day sensibility, but it's because you know the Medrash. What does the Medrash say, Lee? You wanted to say something?
Only that I think this is the Medrash, that we're supposed to accept God as our master.
Yeah, exactly.
Queen.
Exactly. Says Lee, says the Medrash, right? And this is based on the Gemara. This is a Gemara in Kedushin also. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. I'm sorry. Ma ra ozen. What's the point of piercing his ear? Mikol shar ivarim shivaguf, as opposed to everything else. Like, what's the point of doing this? Amar Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, Ozen zo, this ear, sheshama al har Sinai lo tignov, this ear that heard, don't steal. Bahalach v'ganav, that stole, right? and stole, and therefore had to be sold into slavery. That's how a Jewish slave gets sold into slavery. They steal, they don't have the money to pay back, they get sold into slavery. So you poke his ear. And then the Gemara continues, what happens if he was just poor and destitute, so he sold himself? Ozen sheshama al Harsinai kili b'nei Yisrael avadim, that the ear that heard by Harsinai that you are my slaves, i.e., servants of God, and not slaves to other people, and then chose to get himself a master. So you pierced their ear. That should be the case. Why the doorpost? Why the door frame? Continues the Medrash, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Delet u'mezuzah shahayu edim b'Mitzrayim, the doorpost and the lentil that was the witnesses in Egypt that I passed over your houses, because you put the blood there. Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim, because I said that the Jewish people are my slaves and not anyone else's, meaning we are reserved for God's service and not other people's service. Halach zeh kana adon latzmo. And why didn't God himself a master for himself? And therefore, it changes, right? So, first of all, that's what's going on here. Now, why is this happening now? Right? When should this happen? If this is a punishment for stealing, when does the piercing ear happen?
After his 6 years, if he doesn't want to go free.
Right. So why doesn't it happen right away? Meaning he stole 6 years ago, maybe more.
But we're talking about a decision to accept a different master, which doesn't apply until the end of his mandatory term.
Well, but what about the first part? The ear that heard, don't steal. That. So I think part of the answer is, well, it depends. If after 6 years the slavery itself was a punishment, so he doesn't need another punishment, right? How do we know if it's a punishment or not? It depends. If he's excited about his freedom and he wants to get his freedom back, he's not going to stay as a servant. So that's one thing. But here, this is a person who's grown to love his security and the safety and the reliability of his master and loves his family and blah, 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 right? So now he's choosing to stay. So he never really learned his lesson. So now we're teaching a new lesson. We didn't need to do that before because the slaver itself was supposed to do that. Once the slaver didn't accomplish that, so now we have to choose. We have to sort of be a little bit stronger. And the same thing is true with the rest of them. Until this point, it was imposed on him. He doesn't have to go back to his master. Right? He doesn't have to go back to his master. The 6-year debt is done. He's paid his time. The fact that now he's making this decision, so we have to do that now. That's why this happens now. Where do I have to do it? Right? And I don't mean on him. I mean in the house. Where do I connect this post? Not your questions in the pasuk. Very good show. Where do I connect this poker, this needle thing? Not a trick question. Verse number 6. Where do I bring him to poke his ear?
The door.
Bring him to the court, to the Beit Din.
You bring him to the court, and what? But where do they put the thing? Is it hanging from the roof? No, it's El Hadelet, the El Mezuzah, right?
The doorpost.
Right. Says Rash. So according to halacha, right? What would you say? Where are the places that are appropriate? The door or the doorpost, right? The mezuzah or the delet, right? Except Rashi quotes for us a fascinating Gemara that actually teaches us something very different. This is where I want to sort of think about for a few minutes the gap between pshat and halacha and how that applies. Rashi says over here, if you have it in front of you, Yachol shetehe mezuzah keshera. Maybe you could say from this verse that a mezuzah is a good place to use to poke the ear. Talmud Lomar, it says differently, v'natata be'ozno u'badelet. You put it in the delet and the mezuzah. I'm sorry, in the ear and the delet. This is a quote from, if you turn quickly to Devarim 15:17, right? Devarim 15:17 says the same, we're repeating this idea, right? I don't want to leave. Because I love my master, I love my life, I love this. Because it's good for me there. Right? You take this poker thing, and you put it in the door and you slam the door, right? It doesn't say mezuzah here. So says the Gemara, it means that you can't use the door, you can't use the mezuzah anymore. Hekish, you can't use the mezuzah over here at all. And it's only the door. Bedelet, yes, but mezuzah low. So why does it say mezuzah over here? Continues the Gemara. Ha'amar tamen lomar ara mezuzah. Why does it tell you then in the mezuzah over here? Hekish delet limezuzah. It compares delet to the mezuzah. It compares the door to the doorpost. Ma mezuzah mi omed. Just like a mezuzah needs to be standing up, it needs to be upright to be characteristic of a door frame. So too, the hinges and the door needs to be set upright to fulfill this, and you can't do it when it's laying on the ground or some other way. All right, ends the Gemara, ends Rashi on this topic. The question is, right, that's great, but the pshat seems very clear. According to this verse, why am I allowed to do this, or where must I do this? The door or the doorpost? Why is it that we take the Torah and we sort of put it in a different direction? You could have said that the pasuk in Devarim means delet. Delet is a general category. There's the door, and the door has a door and a doorpost. Like there are other ways. So what is going on here, right? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. Some just push it aside. Some people say that pshat, simple explanation of the verses, are only to be understood through the lens of Torah Sheba'al Peh, through the lens of the oral law, through the lens of the Gemara. And it's not really fair to read the verses at face value, right? You have to understand what the Gemara is saying. Any sort of implied interpretation otherwise is incorrect, right? One example about this is, famously about the Gra. The Vilna Gaon, on this very verse, is troubled by this idea. And in his commentary, this is the 18th century, in his commentary on this verse, if you're following Sefaria, it's called Ader Eliyahu, he says the following thing. Shata Dikra, the simple explanation of the verse, Gam HaMezuzah Kshera. Even a mezuzah is kosher. Aval halacha, but the regular halacha, the accepted halachic practice, okeret et hamikra, uproots the simple explanation of the verse. V'chein beruba shel parsha zu, and with most of the parsha here. V'chein b'kama parshiot shebatorah, and lots of different parshiot in the Torah. V'chein migadlo toratenu sheba'al peh shehi, that, and this is part of the greatness of our Torah, that the Torah sheba'al peh, Shehi halacha leMoshe Sinai, that it's the halacha that Moshe learned. Vihi, and it's like kechomer chotem, like clay in the hands of a shaper, that they could do whatever they want, right? And the oral tradition teaches this, and there are other examples of this. V'chein pigo. Pigo is this idea that, according to the verse at least, it seems to be a situation where you eat the food, you eat a sacrifice after the right amount of time. Says the rabbis, no, that's not what pigul means. Pigul, hold on, I'll give you the exact verse just to bring us all onto the same page. So the Torah tells us in Vayikra Yutet Zayin, that you have a certain amount of days to eat a sacrifice, right? You bring a sacrifice, when you sacrifice a peace offering to God, whenever you want, you can do it. On the day of its sacrifice, you can eat it. And on the next day, and if you eat it on the third day, you should burn it. And whatever's left over on the third day, you should burn. And if you eat it on the third day, it's considered pigul, and it's not allowed. right? Seems very clear. What is pigul? Pigul is eating it on the third day. What do the rabbis teach us? What do the rabbis teach us? The rabbis teach us, no, that eating it on the third day is considered a notar. What is the prohibition of pigul? If I had in mind when I sacrificed it to eat it beyond the appropriate time. That's pigul, right? It seems to completely contradict with a simple explanation of the verses. So says the Gra over here that you just realized with Sarach Sheyeda Shipshuto Shel Torah Shiada Hachotem. It's the simple explanation of the Torah is what the oral law intended for it, and it can be sort of flexible and malleable based on what was the oral tradition provided from from Hashem to Moshe and Moshe to us. That is the Gra. Now it's a little bit hard to accept that theologically because many, including like the Rambam and others, suggests that part of our job in understanding Torah, understanding halacha, is to understand how we go from the Torah Shebektav, from the written text, to the Torah Shebal Peh, to the oral text. That's what the Rambam includes in the idea of Talmud, of study. And if that's the case, you can't just say it's arbitrary, right? Oh, it's just what the tradition is. Then what are we trying to figure out? So others try to work on this in different scenarios. So I want to give two explanations of this attempt, of what this looks like and how this moves forward. So Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, and by the way, each of these needs to be analyzed on its own. We're just going to analyze this idea of the martzea, of the piercing of the ear. Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, in his commentary, notes that this is based on a textual hook. That the reason why the oral tradition presented this way, it's not just arbitrary, that this is what God intended and told Moshe, but wrote something else. But actually, there is something more going on here. We have to look at the totality of the Torah, as the rabbis look at to be dorish the pasuk, to explain the pasuk, and the totality of the law teaches us some other verses. This idea that the slave gets pierced after 7 years, or after 6 years of service, in the seventh year, it also comes up in Dvarim, as we just alluded to. And in Dvarim, it doesn't say delet; it only says mezuzah. And so the rabbis are trying to solve a textual issue here. And the textual issue here is that they are looking at different texts in the Torah, different ways that this is presented from different perspectives. We'll come back to this. Why does the Torah tell us about it in different places? That we'll get back to in a moment. And so it's door like doorpost, right? And all of this is to highlight the idea that we're like a servant. It's the comparison or the contrast to be a servant of God. But also, Devarim tells us that it's only door and not mezuzah, right? And so the mezuzah here is here to highlight a halachic reality that the door needs to be upright and to help fill out the connection to the blood being placed on the door and on the mezuzah, which is exactly the reason that Rashi highlights for this whole process, to remind the Jew that they are the Jew who was saved from Egypt, who was saved to hear God's words on Har Sinai not to steal, and who was saved to understand that they are supposed to serve God and not serve other people. And so says Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, this isn't random, this isn't arbitrary, this isn't just clay in the hands of the melder, but the rabbis looked at all the different sources that the Torah describes, and they recognized that not all of them are the same. So it must be that we're highlighting door. But why do we throw in mezuzah also? To remember these other pieces as well, to remind us of that. So it won't get us to the final halacha, but it helps shape the context, the contours, the understanding of this detail and the meaning it has behind us. That's Rav David Tzvi Hoffman's approach, and it might exist in lots of different places.
So, Rabbi, until when was the practice of slave in this context practiced?
I don't know.
I mean, like it was even up to the time of through the end of the temples, or did it last after that?
So the Talmud debates the laws, but it doesn't mean it was the practice to do it then. there were definitely stories of slaves. I don't know if they are Jewish slaves or not Jewish slaves. Um, um, I don't know. I would make an educated guess. It's sort of the time of the temple and maybe like the Mishnaic period. But even the Mishnaic period, I think it's probably too late. I would say like the latest is the temple, maybe. But I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that.
There's
Um,
there's another issue, and that is why the door or the doorpost? Why not a wall, Homa? Why not someplace else?
so
Entire
that's the point over here. You're
this,
trying to evoke Yetziat Mitzrayim.
I mean, to me, I see the symbolism as the person who has the hole going through his ear is making a decision which way to go, and the door is a um, analogy. That's not really the right word, but it's it's symbolic of going in or going out.
I hear that, and that might be true. I don't think that is, that might be additional parts of that. Um, yeah, I mean, the challenge is you have the question you would want to see is there some source for that within, besides for some folksy, more of a folks sort of etymological sort of approach. Um, and I think that's where like if that's the case, then just door. Why do we need this door, the mezuzah also, right? The mezuzah here is to highlight there's some significance to mezuzah, particularly in the Shemos story, that warrants its inclusion, even though it's not really a good spot for it, right? We want doors that are like mezuzahs, right? That's ultimately how you're supposed to read this verse. How do you read this verse? You poke his ear in a door that's like a mezuzah, i.e., a door that is upright and working, and not that's on the floor. Um, so why do we care about that detail about the mezuzah part? So that in Shmos makes a lot of sense that would connect us back to the Exodus story that happened just a few parshiot ago. Whereas in Devarim, that detail is not as relevant to the people who are hearing that story 40 years later. And so when we recap it, we just say door. Right, we don't need to add the mezuzah. The mezuzah, according to Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, to the Jews hearing this at this moment, their first connection to mezuzah is what? The blood that you put on the doorposts in Egypt. And even though mezuzah isn't really the place that's supposed to be, we want to bring mezuzah into this conversation because it has a philosophical, theological meaning, resonance for the people. That you're servants to God and you're not servants to other people. Right. And so all of the drashot, all the logic behind it, actually, all the philosophy behind it actually helps be a halachic factor in the decision of this. That's Rav David Tzvi Hoffman. Let's take one more approach of this idea. This is presented by a couple people. I saw it recently in a work written by Rav Amnon Bazak, who's more of a contemporary writer, and he quotes it from some other people. And then that's the case. But let's look at this. Rav Amnon Bazak asked the following question: when I say mezuzah, what's the first thing you think about?
What we call mezuzah today.
Exactly. You think of the scroll hanging on your door. What's that really called?
Actually, I don't know.
No, there's no name for it. So that's good, right? It says, what does it say? We say it twice a day in the Shema, right? Sorry, we say it twice in the morning in the Shema. We say it twice every time we say Shema, right? What do we say? Uksavtem, zot beitecha v'sharecha. You should write it on the doorposts of your house and of your gates, meaning of your entryways. Meaning, write these words. What should you? We colloquially refer to it as the mezuzah, right? Some people think the mezuzah is actually just the case, right? It takes like I sometimes have to remind people like it's not just the case. The case is nice, but the scroll inside is what's really it's all about. But even the scroll isn't really the mezuzah, right? So the mezuzah, that's the mezuzah, right? That's the mezuzah. What's going on here? What's the whole point of the mezuzah? By the way, even for tefillin, this comes up. Says Rashbam, says Rashi's grandson, that when it says the tefillin, you should put it between your eyes and on your heart and between your eyes, and on your arm, right? you could read that as metaphoric, right? It means take these words to heart, put them in your head, put them on your hands, make them your daily work. Who said you're such a literalist, right? But introduces the Rashbam and others suggest this notion that part of the way we make things real is we take metaphors and we make them physical. We do something with them. And what's the best way to make sure that you incorporate the way of the Torah into your house, into your daily life? By putting on tefillin, right? Others will say, no, the Torah always intended, the pshat is the physical manifestation of the philosophical idea. That's for the Rashbam to argue. We can debate that later. Says Rab Bazak, what happens over here? What's going on over here? What does mezuzah come to represent? Mezuzah comes to represent this idea of written Torah on our doorposts. Written Torah on our doorposts, is that a place where one is to pierce the ear of someone you're trying to hold accountable? Of course not, right? That doesn't seem appropriate. Suggests Rav Bazak and other commentaries as well, that what happens, what Chazal is taking consideration is the totality of the psukim around mezuzah and this distinction between mezuzah and delet, between door and the doorpost. And there's a case to be made that it's not really the proper place to do this action anymore. Mezuzah becomes transformed based on the mitzvah of putting the scroll on our doorposts to a holy location, a holy object, a makom ketivat sefer Torah, a makom of Torah writing. And therefore, it doesn't really fit that it should be, that this should happen there. So the rabbis interpret the text in a way to highlight, to be in constant, not just factors that are in the verses of the laws of Eved, but really looks at the Torah in totality. And in totality, mezuzah is a sacred place. And the rabbis say that the oral law is highlighting to us that in a sacred place, that can't be the case. And therefore, mezuzah is actually teaching us something else over here, right? It's actually quite logical. It wouldn't make sense to make such a construct of the mezuzah and then also use it for this action. Right. And so that also helps. There's logic behind why the oral tradition that was passed to Moshe was created this way. We still want to evoke Yetziat Mitzrayim. We still want to evoke the notion of the blood on the doorposts. But we also understand that when we consider the sum total of what the Torah is teaching us, that mezuzah has a very special place in our tradition. And therefore, it's not appropriate to do something like that. And that presents, again, another sort of nuanced perspective of how the oral tradition isn't just totally arbitrarily adjusting what the Torah says and sort of saying God said this and meant this, but is explaining to us, right? The Torah presents it this way. It's trying to capture certain things, but it means this. And we get from point A to point C by understanding what the Torah means by mezuzah everywhere, what the Torah is trying to evoke and for us to think about when it reads mezuzah over here, right? There are three essential mezuzah moments in the Torah. There's mezuzah that you and I think about when we say mezuzah, which is a scroll on the doorpost. There's mezuzah of the blood on the doorpost in Egypt, and then there's mezuzah of the piercing. Those last two, or the first two chronologically, the last two that I just quoted, those we want to evoke by the Eved. But by the slave, we don't want to get into the special location where we write Torah, where we think about Torah, where Torah is static. And therefore, we sort of exit mezuzah from the equation, right? All of this is to try to help understand this gap between pshat and drash. I want to just go to one more example, and that is just the last part of this verse. How long is the servant a slave for?
Trick question.
Right. Yeah, is this a trick question, Rabbi? I mean, 6 years.
No, after he gets pierced, how long is he a servant for?
Forever.
Is it really forever?
Oh, until
His master
Jubilee.
dies or something, or
No,
Jubilee.
until the Yovel. Until the Yovel.
Yovel, yeah.
He's a slave until the Yovel, until the Jubilee. I don't understand. Why does it say he's a slave forever?
Right, that's what it says.
How come in Dvarim, I'm sorry, and in Dvarim it says that also. In Vayikra, where we also learn it, we say that it's for for 50 years or up to the Yovel. So it could be 50 years, it could be less. So
Maybe
again,
it seemed like
what?
maybe it seemed like forever.
So part of the answer for that, again, is presented by understanding that the Torah is presenting different lenses at different times to these observances. In Mishpatim, this is presented by Rav Moshe Lichtenstein. He writes about this in different places. In Mishpatim, what we're presented over here is the torts law, the civil law between you and me. Between you and me, if you want to sell yourself forever, I can buy you forever, right? There's nothing that is limiting between our relationship that should prevent that. What is the laws of in Vayikra all about when we read about Vayikra in this? Right? What are the laws in Vayikra about this? So if you look in Vayikra, hold on, and pull it up. Vayikra, it says, it's right by the laws of Shemitah and Yovel. What are we learning about the laws of Shemitah and Yovel? What's the reason for Shemitah and Yovel there? Because Yovel's holy, right? What's the reason of Yovel? That the land belongs to God and doesn't belong to anyone else, right? Right? It's all about Kili Kol Haaretz, right? So what is the reason why the slave can't work forever? Not because of the relationship between you and me, but because there's another factor here. We're all servants of God. From our relationship to God, I can't forever own a human being. And for our relationship with God, I can't forever be a slave, right? We're all supposed to fulfill our destiny as servants of God. And so part of what is part of the presentation here is there are different reasons that are presented. There are different factors that go into the restrictions of a Jewish slave. From a torts perspective, from a civil law perspective, I can own a slave. You can sell yourself as a slave for as long as you want. But from a religious perspective, I mean, they're both religious perspective, but from a Ben Adam L'Malkom perspective, from a recognition that I am a servant of God and God owns the whole world. So I can't violate that, right? And says Rav Moshe, different places where the Torah repeats different halachot sometimes highlights different facets of the logic behind the halacha. And therefore, from a purely monetary perspective, I might be able to do something, but from a ritual or religious is again the wrong word because all of this is religious, but from a relationship to God perspective, I can't. And so that's, again, where we see this difference over here. Part of what Rav Moshe then highlights, again, is that when we're interpreting the Torah and we're trying to understand the Pshat, you can understand the Pshat in a local location with the reasons that the local location, i.e. Shemot, tells us. But you have to, when you're building the total picture of what this institution is trying to teach us, you have to look at every instance in the Torah and understand that there are different motivating factors, different motivating reasons to make that happen, right? And that, again, will then contribute to what's the way that the rabbis are interpreting the text, or the drasha is presented to us from Halacha Moshe Sinai, because we're only getting one lens of it, but every drasha that's going to be practical has to take consideration all the lenses. All right. I know this is a little bit more abstract, but it is a important sort of question for us to think about as we look. There's so many examples of this where you see a verse, but it's interpreted a slightly different way, and the halachic implication is a little bit different. And so we have to ask ourselves what exactly is going on here. And what we presented is, I would say maybe three and a half positions over here. One is sort of a throw your hands up in the air and say, there is no such thing as pshat. There's only what halacha tells us. There are definitely people who suggest that. There are others who say, no, the pshat is trying to take consideration all the different locations, or the halacha is trying to consideration all the different locations that this idea is taught, and bring them into one dynamic set of laws. That's Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, excuse me. And or you could take Rav Bazak, who might even make that broader. We look at all this, what the Torah tells us about everything is going to impact the way the law is. And so even though mezuzah might make sense over here, there are other things about mezuzah that prevents it from doing that. And then Ramosha sort of sharpens that by noting this idea in this situation that there are times when we are taught the same thing in different locations. And the reason, the driving, motivating factor based on the context and where they are will be different, and that will teach us different values, and which are then reflected in different halachot in the way they're presented. So we'll stop here. Thanks for the ride, coming along for the ride, and we'll continue next week.
Thank
Thank
you
Rob.
and welcome
Thank
home.
you.
Take care.